In April of 2012, I was able to make a visit to the Shiloh battlefield on the eve of the 150th anniversary of the battle. And I took a tour with this gentleman who gave us some very insightful information into the battle that will help us understand a lot about what the Civil War was really like. And I brought along a couple of hundred of my close personal friends. Now, our guide gave us great insight into why the battle was at Shiloh Meeting House. It was all due to General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, he had been kind of drummed out of the Army a couple months before this. He had made some rash statements about how long and how much it would take to win the Civil War, and they thought he was crazy. And he was suffering from depression and alcoholism, but he was a close personal friend of U.S. Grant, and Grant wanted him as one of his generals, and so he brought him back. And Sherman knew of this Shiloh Meeting House, and he said, it's a great place to train troops. It's about 20 miles from Corinth, Mississippi. It'll be a real great place to stage the invasion of the South. But this other gentleman, General Halleck, was very worried about Sherman, and he gave Sherman very strict orders. He says, do not engage the enemy until Buell arrives from Nashville, where you could be drummed out of the Army again. Sherman liked being in the Army. He wanted to help Grant, and so he was going to not engage the enemy. So General Grant brings his army to the Shiloh Meeting House, and they set up their encampment. They put out pickets to guard against any intruders or spies. And 2 days before the battle, the pickets report that deer are running at them. Now, these are country boys who have been hunting their whole life, and they know that deer do not run at men with guns unless there's something more scarier than they are. And then what else could that be but maybe another army? And so they report this to their superiors, and they report this to Sherman. And General Sherman says, General Halleck has ordered me not to engage the army until Buell arrives. Buell is still in Nashville. Ignore the pickets. So one day before the battle, there's another set of pickets, and they hear a commotion in the woods. So they go off into the woods to see what it is. Well, stupidity is not a unique characteristic of just the Union Army. A Confederate officer has his Confederate troops drilling within the earshot of the Union Army. A small skirmish occurs, and there's several Confederate soldiers are captured, brought before Sherman. And Sherman says, Halleck has ordered me not to engage the enemy until Buell arrives. Buell has just left Nashville. Send those prisoners to the rear. Now, the morning of the battle, rumors had been circulating in the encampment that something was up. They've heard about the prisoners, they've heard about the deer running at people, and the soldiers are getting anxious, in particular this gentleman. Now we look at that name and think, well, that must be Colonel Everett Peabody, but no. He was from Massachusetts, he was a Harvard graduate, and he pronounced his name Colonel Peabody. Well, Colonel Peabody was sure that the enemy was at hand, and so early on the morning of April 6th, he went out with his men, and he ran into the 45,000 troops of General Albert Sidney Johnston. Brief military encounter occurred, he disengaged, went back, reported to his superior, "Sir, the enemy approaches." He was immediately dressed down. He said, you were ordered not to engage the enemy. At the end of the day, you will be lucky if you aren't court-martialed. But they went to General Sherman to report the news. And what does General Sherman say? General Halleck has ordered me not to engage the enemy till Buell arrives. Buell is somewhere between here and Nashville. I cannot engage the enemy. He gets on his horse, he and his staff right out to the front line. They run right into the advancing Confederate forces. Legend says that he raised his hand and yelled, "Stop!" Well, Confederate infantrymen do not obey Union generals. They look at that line of officers on their horses and think, this is a turkey shoot, and they all kneel and blast off a volley. General Sherman gets a handful of buckshot. The officer on the horse next to him is shot dead. They wheel, turn, and retreat, and the Battle of Shiloh is off. So on the first day of the battle, the Confederate forces basically swept the Union forces from the field. At the end of the day, the Union forces had their backs to the Tennessee River. They're 200 or 300 yards from the river. The only thing, according to our battlefield guide, that kept the Union from being swept into the Tennessee River was that even though Grant and Sherman claimed that they were not surprised, the diaries of the Confederate soldiers says, well, if you weren't surprised, you left us a really nice breakfast. And the Confederate soldiers stopped to eat breakfast. And that slight delay kept them from pushing the Union Army into the Tennessee River. And legend has it that that night, General Grant was leaning against a tree, and General Sherman walks up to him and says, well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we? To which General Grant replied, yes, but we'll lick 'em tomorrow, though. At that point, they hear a steamboat whistle. It's Buell. He has arrived from Nashville with 25,000 fresh troops, which they unload during the night. And on the second day of the battle, basically the Union Army sweeps the Confederates from the field. And at the end of the second day, the armies ended up where they started 2 days ago. However, when the casualties are counted, the nation is in shock. The 112,000 men who went into the battle, roughly 3,500 were killed, 3,800 were missing, and 16,400 were wounded. If you added up all the casualties of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War, this 2 days of casualties exceeded all three of those wars. The nation was in shock. This wasn't supposed to go this way. It was supposed to be over quickly. The war had already lasted a year, and these casualties just shocked the nation. Plus, it wasn't just privates that passed away. Even today, it's hard to understand with this fickle finger of fate, why did some survive and some pass? We've heard the story of William Tecumseh Sherman. He rode right up to the front line. The Confederate soldiers had an open shot at him. He gets a handful of buckshot. The officer on the horse next to him dies. Here's a Southern general, Albert Sidney Johnston. In the battle, he was sitting on his horse observing the action, was shot in the leg. He had sent his surgeon off to care for Union soldiers, and he bled to death. A simple tourniquet would have saved his life. However, being the Southern gentleman, he felt it was his duty and honor to care for the enemy, and that decision cost him his life. Here's another Southern general. Now, after the first 2 days of the battle, the Union Army continued to pursue the Southerners into Mississippi. And at a battle of Fallen Timbers, this general, seeing himself outnumbered 5-1, decided at all costs the Union advance must be stopped. So he ordered a suicide charge of his cavalry brigade. It panicked the Union Army. They stopped. They ran in fear. And most of the Confederates stopped, but this general just kept wildly charging at the Union soldiers, and finally he turned around. He was the only Confederate surrounded by Union soldiers. He was shot. He managed to shoot one of the Union soldiers, grab him by the neck, pull him up over his back to cover his retreat, and he retreated back to the Confederate lines and survived the suicide charge. This gentleman is Nathan Bedford Forrest, and after the war, he founded the Ku Klux Klan. This brings us back to our Colonel Peabody. Our battlefield guide told us he did not have to worry about being court-martialed because on the first day of the battle, a cannonball bounced and took his head off, so he did not survive the day. However, roughly 100 years later, there were two writers who had been assigned the task of coming up with a segment for a new cartoon show. And in this segment of the cartoon show, it was to be about a dog who had a time machine and take his boy back into history and give his boy history lessons. Knowing the story of Colonel Peabody and General Sherman, they just couldn't resist. So, according to our battlefield guide, that's how we ended up with Mr. Peabody and his boy Sherman. And that was the end of our battlefield tour.